Hello, welcome to the Career Discovery podcast. On the show today, we'll be learning about our guests' area of expertise, their career journey, and what they wish they'd known when they were just starting out. Thanks so much for watching. We really hope you enjoy the show. Hello, Farley, welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Very pleased to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. Okay. How about we get started by you telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it for.
Right, let me try and keep track of those questions. In my current incarnation, I'm CEO of a relatively small business that I co-founded a couple of years ago. And in parallel with that, I'm an executive coach working with executives across industries. What else is there to say? I mean, I kind of got into coaching off the back of quite a long corporate career at one of the world's largest banks, HSBC. Had a lot of different roles, from being a salesperson at the front line to being global head of sales, and then running a global business, albeit a small one, for a very large bank, on behalf of the investment banking division. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing now and how I fell into it.
All right, thank you. Now, this is a podcast, so tell us about the podcasts that you're enjoying right now.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's hardly any time, but having said that, there are two actually that come to mind. One is somebody who's actually been a guest of my own of a podcast that I host, Bruce Daisley, and he has this business culture related podcast called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. So I follow Bruce and his podcast avidly. And then maybe for something completely different, there's a historian called Eliza Philby, Dr. Eliza Philby, who's also launched a podcast, but a very unusual one where she interviews relatives. So for example, mother and daughter, or father and daughter, all sorts of permutations, but focusing on the differences between the generations. And I think she's just interviewed Alistair Campbell and someone younger than Alistair Campbell with Campbell in their surname. So yeah. I don't know what the relationship is, but that's a really interesting insight into the different generations, hearing from them both at the same time.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. I haven't heard of that second one. I have heard of Bruce though, and actually went to a talk of his once. He's a really great speaker and talks about some really important topics. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on to your area of expertise, coaching. So there are always misconceptions about the work we do, which is one of the reasons we wanted to create this podcast. So tell us about the common misconceptions of coaching. What do friends and family outside of the industry think you're doing all day?
It's a great question, Joe. So one thing that actually slightly irks me, and it's a bit, I don't know, perhaps it's a bit judgmental, but I think for some people, there isn't such a thing as different kinds of coaching. Everybody who's not in sports as a coach is a life coach.
Yeah.
And so if I start talking about coaching, now and then somebody says, oh, yes, life coaching. Yeah, that's interesting. And I sort of stop for a bit, because that isn't what I do. I coach, people in business with a focus on their performance and well-being. And yes, I think that's clearly part of life. But life coaching feels like another specialization, which I don't feel particularly equipped to help people with. But, business and executive coaching is really what I do. So that's one thing that often seems to get blurred. The other thing, maybe, I remember one of my nephews is, very successful, 30-something-year-old. He, we have quite a playful relationship, and he often says, Farley, only you could get paid so much for just talking. And I kind of thought, that sort of belies another myth, that you're just sitting around and chatting and people pay for that. When in reality, there's a lot of thinking and preparation, and there's some reflecting afterwards, and there's a lot to do on your feet, in addition to kind of challenging but also supporting your client at often difficult times in their careers, or difficult episodes. So another myth, I suppose, to go back to your question, is it can seem it can be undervalued. In contrast, say, to being an engineer or a surgeon, or somebody that's manifesting their skills in some tangible way. What else is there? I think, counterintuitively, another myth, or orthodoxy perhaps, is that that there's going to be this never-ending demand for coaching. And I, for one, and I think I'm slightly contrarian in this respect, I actually think there's a bit of coach mania going on, and it isn't an easy route to being successful. I actually know that most coaches really struggle, and I think there's a sort of another myth that it's something that kind of involves working half as much and getting paid twice as much, because there's this limitless demand for coaching.
Yeah.
And yes, there is a lot of demand, and the demand has grown a lot. But I think along with that has come more rigor in terms of professional qualifications, accreditation, and what you bring over and above being able to say, I'm a coach. And I guess, to give you an analogy, you can't say you're in elite sport, you can't just say you're a running coach. I mean, this doesn't get you very far. You need to be able to help with something very specific within a very complex, sophisticated sport or activity. And I believe executive coaching, or say workplace coaching, is similar. That you need to know what your strengths are as a coach. You need to define credibly and confidently a niche. And I think if you can do that well, then I think probably you would be in demand and be quite successful. But that's probably enough mythology for one podcast, Jo.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And tell us about executive coaching and what your clients, be that individuals or organizations, rely on you for.
Gosh, yeah, that's a big question, and a good one. Yeah, so I have both kinds of clients, and I mean, it's slightly unusual in that I'm typically hired by chief executives of organizations to coach them. And so in a way, it's an individual, but really with an organization sponsoring the work, or it's organizations typically the managers of someone that might benefit from coaching, or of course someone in human resources or the people function. So I have experience of being hired by both an individual, except they happen to also run the organization, but the organization. And I think the answer depends on which of these routes I'm on. Typically with senior executives, CEOs, or board members, or just people in quite high pressure, high responsibility roles, whether they know it at the beginning or not, and I'll come back to that. I think mostly they really value the impartial, independent sounding board, private challenge. And, there is this saying that it's pretty lonely at the top. And, particularly if you're responsible for a big part of an organization or the organization as a whole, you are in an unusual position where you have people in your governance, who are in charge of governing you or governing your work, and then everybody else you're responsible for. So there is this challenge of where to go to be you without being judged or without having some kind of power in the relationship. And so that's a pretty common reason, at least in my case, and I think it's pretty common. More and more senior leaders do have external coaches, independent coaches. Other than that, I think there can be sort of things that happen that are time bound. So there could be a particularly stressful episode, like an acquisition or a big structural change to an organization, and senior executives may be supported through that with some external coaching. From the organizational route, I think, maybe this is another myth that all coaches are hired because there's some amazing talent to unlock. But the reality is a little bit more balanced, I think, that it is still the case, in my experience, that there are people that are undoubtedly strong contributors, considered to be future leaders, but are perhaps behaving in ways that are not their best, not getting the best out of themselves or not getting the best out of others. And so that starting point is, we need to somehow get that modified before it becomes a bigger problem. So that is a kind of, let's say, corrective starting point. And then I think, but with a very good intention to help somebody stay on the right path or not get derailed, or do a bit less of something that is causing problems. That's one reason coaches can be deployed, including me. On the other side, I think it has been growing as a reason, whereby it's almost getting to the point where, in some cases, perhaps in some sectors, including financial services in particular, there isn't a reason. It's almost seen very healthily as, this person is doing a very challenging role for the organization and would be supported with some impartial external counsel or coaching. And it isn't about fixing something or preparing them for something. It is an adjunct, or sort of like, I don't know, the word escapes me now, but, just a kind of a healthy part of the ecosystem around particular individuals. So there's the, let's try and iron out that wrinkle reason. There's the coaching is actually a solid part of an ecosystem for individuals. And then perhaps a third reason, and then I'll stop, Joe, is the flip side really of a problem, which is somebody has already proven themselves to be on a fast track and is supported in a very steep trajectory. And I myself fell into that. Sounds a bit self-congratulatory, but I myself fell into that third route where, I became a managing director at, I think it was, when I was 30, I had a global role from when I was, 27. And, I think back now, I think, oh gosh, really? They took a bit of a bet. And, I actually had 3 very experienced executive coaches in quite a short period of time. I suspect because I was, there were a few things I was doing that were probably, undesirable. so I probably fitted into both. Let's iron out a few wrinkles and let's support this relatively inexperienced senior person with lots of executive coaching. But it really worked on me. And hence, from, my late, early 30s, I've been a real advocate of the power of coaching, being coachable, as I believe I really was, and also being open to being challenged about what you're doing well, what you're not doing very well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I guess the key themes I'm hearing are enabling, corrective, supporting, but also holding the space for somebody who needs a sounding board or a confidant. So a myriad of reasons.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I've probably left out some blindingly obvious ones that your listeners are thinking, gosh, he's left out the elephant in the room, but I don't think so. But yeah, myriad is the right word.
Thank you very much. So if we were to zoom in on an average day or week in your work, what would we find you doing?
Well, I think, there was a period. So, you asked really at the outset how long I've been doing this for, and I didn't give you a clear answer. But, my corporate career, was about 20 years. And then for about 8 years now, I've really been an executive coach. And over the past 2 years, alongside being an executive coach to senior executives mainly, I've co-founded this business that I'm CEO of. So the answer really depends on when on this timeline, we zoom in on. But today, I'm really juggling and wearing 2 very different hats, running a small organization on the one hand, dealing with investors, dealing with clients, building product, creating the kind of culture that I would advise or coach CEOs to build. And about 15 to 20% of my time really continuing to coach a fewer number of clients that I'm really quite pleased to be working with and helping. Yeah. So today it's, there's a lot of plates spinning, but an average day, I'm probably coaching 1 or 2 individuals a week now. Yeah. And typically I personally, and I know there's a lot of variability in this, tend to favor slightly longer sessions, at least an hour, perhaps up to 2 hours. I know that some coaches advocate, 45 minutes. And the running of the business, you don't need me to elaborate on. It's all over the place. But when I was really purely playing the executive coach role, which actually was quite a lot of this 8-year timeline, 6 of those 8 years, there was a lot more coaching going on, and in a lot more contexts. So it may be that I'm in an organization working with a cohort of managers or leaders in both group settings, but also in between group meetings, working with them one-to-one, coaching them as part of a broader program of change. I used to love that. And then there are these assignments that are quite time bound, where I'm working for, say, 6 months over 6 sessions. and they're also great because you have a sense of needing to get something achieved within a time frame, and there is a kind of scarcity created by you've got 12 hours with this client and you've only got 6 months. So that's a different kind of activity almost. And then much longer term relationships, typically with CEOs, where there isn't really an A to B. There is this kind of, as you said, the safe space that's created for them, and they value that over much longer periods of time. And you can really build a strong platform. I'm mixing answering this question with a different one, Joe. I'm mindful of that. But it's very hard for me to tell you what's going on a typical day. But the difficulty I face now, if I'm candid, is switching gears from the inevitable pressures and stresses of running a small startup effectively, with being fully present and tuning into the client's world, and taking time really to recollect what their world was the last time you were with them.
Yeah.
And having the presence of mind to be fully attentive. And that is something that I'm pulling off, but it is something new to me, because when you're only coaching, you build in lots of gaps between clients. You're always in that kind of mode.
Yeah.
Whereas now I'm kind of on both sides of the fence almost. And in some ways it kind of helps me actually now relate even more to my CEO clients, because, their stresses and strains of my current lived experience. Yeah. So in a way there's that's helped and challenged me at the same time.
Yeah. Brene Brown has a really nice analogy of being at a party or something and having to constantly run from the balcony down onto the dance floor. So, at the balcony being the CEO role and the dance floor being the executive coaching itself. And that can be exhausting, sort of running up and down those stairs all day. So I quite like that analogy. If we were to zoom in on the executive coaching, perhaps when that made up more of your role, I think it's really important that we share with the audience that it's not just one-to-one and, group coaching sessions where you're actually interacting with people. So, there's prep that's involved. There's sort of post conversation work that needs to be done. There's actually finding the clients in the first place. So if you could perhaps take us back there to give people a sense of what that week might look like, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, you make a really good point, Joe. And I think this is another part of the mythology of coaching, that it can feel quite seductive that you're in a room with a client and you're in quite a privileged position where, your words count by definition, because that's your main tool. So, and actually I alluded to the fact that most coaches struggle. And I think it's a really good point that, when I was building my coaching practice, and living my coaching practice, that already sort of identifies two very different behaviors or activities. And so, I had to give some thought to how do I create interest in me as your coach? Yeah. Your confidant, somebody that you can trust with everything and anything that's on your mind. How do I create that? And so I did give a lot of thought to that. And, I think, I spent quite a bit of time, putting myself into the uncomfortable position of meeting a lot of executives that, I didn't know that worked in companies and sectors that I had no real understanding of, I guess I had the fortune of a career in a large organization, within which I was also a relatively senior person. And so, network really does help, and it definitely counts if you're the product.
Yeah.
And people really do rely on others' recommendations when it comes to this kind of service. And so I gave a lot of thought to business building, network expansion, and that took up quite a bit of my time. There's this there are a couple of buzz phrases, thought leadership and intellectual property or IP, and people, I think, overuse them, and I try my best not to. And I kind of challenged myself, and still do. Is this thought leadership, or is this just recycling of others' thoughts, and therefore not leading but following? And I often do challenge others similarly. It's not thought leadership if you've just read something and you want to talk about it. That's thought recycling. and the reason I emphasize that is that if you really do live by the meaning of thought leadership, or you have that high bar, then you have to devote quite a bit of your working week to something fresh, something different, with the risk that it is either celebrated, which is a good risk to take, or it's ridiculed, perhaps not, but at least it might flop, or somebody, heaven forbid, who's actually one of your target clients wades in and disagrees with you. And that's, I've noticed that quite a lot of coaches that I've interacted with seem to think that they don't need to do that. But I fear that unless you invest that time in niche building, which sounds easy, but it's partly about, what do you want to be known for? What is the edge that you bring? What's that provocation that you want to leave in your potential clients' minds? How are you challenging the status quo or challenging orthodoxies? Those are the things that get you noticed. And going back to your point about what did I spend the average week on, I mean, I probably looked like I was a complete slacker, because I used to play an embarrassingly large amount of hours of squash every week. And then, have these odd 2-hour sessions in a room with somebody and do quite well out of it. But I probably also made it seem very effortless. But I was probably like that swan, busy, feet moving frenetically, metaphorically and on the squash court. But all of that time actually was a really healthy space for me, not just to let go of quite a lot of the stress and tension that you're holding, particularly as you're working one-to-one in such an intense way, but also whilst not coaching and doing, playing squash. I was doing what I keep attributing to Einstein, but I hope I'm right. But he came up with this idea called combinatory play, and I think I engaged in a very healthy amount of combinatory play, whereby taking the break from actively trying to be a thought leader and just playing squash, letting it all kind of play out on the squash court, actually gave me tons of ideas, which I then would manifest in, a LinkedIn article or a point of view that I could talk to clients about before they hire me. Yeah. So there's the practicalities of building a business, the marketing, the finance, the sales process, and all of that, and then the time needed to think about what is your edge, what is your positioning, what's your thinking, and then of course there's the cliche of sitting and talking to someone, but that's almost like a third of the week.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that goes into getting into the room in the end.
Yeah.
So that's probably a very rambling answer to what my average week might have been like when I didn't have another business to run.
Well, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I think it just paints a picture of what it's actually like, which I think is really important. So tell us what you love most about executive coaching.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, yes, it's first of all, it's really edgy because you just never know the outcome. And it's really not, so I like the edginess of it. It's almost like you're always entering into an unknown. How will my client be? What will surface? Will I seemingly add any value? Because coaching by definition is not you as an expert, but you as a resource, as an enabler, as a sort of nutrient almost. So the edginess always attracted me, sort of rising to the challenge almost and being present, but also fleet of foot. There's also the amazing feedback that you get from not obviously all clients, but some that you know really mean it.
Yeah.
That something you've done has really unlocked, been the key to a lock that they've been picking for years, and you've helped them unpick it. They've unpicked it, but really you were there, and it was some sort of shared moment of success, or they're working on a transition that happens, and they think, can't say it was Farley and the coaching, but it's a great coincidence. And it feels like that was part of the reason for success. So, I mean, this is probably, a little bit generic, but so there's the not knowing and the encouragement and inspiration from some rather big impact, you can have as a coach, in any sphere, I guess, but at least from my experience in within organizations. So I love that. I love the variety as well. That you're not, that it's almost, it's almost like you're working on multiple projects simultaneously, and each person, each organization, each team is quite distinct. And I love the variety of that, and of course the goals that clients have. I mean, there are some big themes, but they're also very nuanced and individual, and I love that too. That's quite a lot I like about coaching.
Yeah, that's great. And what about the challenges of the work?
Yes, and this is where I think training and practice and what coaches call supervision, which is a bit of an antiquated word, isn't it? Supervision, or a bit controlling. But it basically, it basically means you yourself being coached as a coach by another coach who is trained to help you with your practice. So that's what supervision means. And so the challenges are that you are dealing quite, maybe not all the time, but quite a significant amount of the time with very challenging situations.
Yeah.
That your clients are sharing with you for one reason or another, and you can take on quite a lot of the tension or the stress or the lived challenge that your clients are experiencing, and that's clearly challenging. And I am quite different when I have a coaching day, let's say, one or two clients, and if they are quite emotionally charged topics, or the work that you're doing with your client is emotionally charged, where you're putting them under some kind of, you're challenging something that they don't necessarily welcome in the moment. It can create some tension, and you can actually have friction at times that ends up being healthy, or you get fired. But it's not a job where you're trying to get on with your client all the time, because that's definitely a route to failure. But equally, you can challenge your clients to the extent where they don't want to accept it. So all of that can be quite difficult. I think coaching in an organizational context also brings another particular challenge that I think people in HR know well, where they are on the one hand colleagues, but they're also on the other hand involved in people decisions. And managers kind of have a bit of this tension as well. They want to be egalitarian, and they want to have teamwork and trust, but on the other hand, they do make decisions that affect everyone in the team. And coaching in that sense is challenging, because you're not in a vacuum with your client, even if they're the CEO. There is an ecosystem that you get involved with, either because you need to go and get feedback from different stakeholders, or you just bump into people that in the lobby. Or you're in the lift with somebody that knows you're coaching, blah, blah. And they go, oh, right, you're still coaching. Gosh, must be quite a challenge, problem child. And so this is another kind of challenge with coaching, that yes, you have to maintain confidentiality, but at the same time, you've got to navigate the client or the sponsor, wanting to have a 30-minute meeting with you to discuss how it's going. And, that requires a different kind of thinking on your feet, where you're respecting boundaries, but also respecting that this is your client asking you how something they're paying for or something they've commissioned is going. So there are quite a few challenges. I think going back to your point, Joe, about what else happens in an average week, I think for a lot of coaches that I've worked with or helped or just know, including me at times, you're selling yourself all the time, and not everybody wants to buy you. And it's very different to selling an organization's product. I mean, it can feel the same. You're so wedded to the car or the widget that your company makes that you feel it as a personal rejection. But with and I guess I'm talking about professional services or consultants, working, representing themselves. I think it can also, there is another challenge of personal rejection, which, I guess, given that the world of coaches has mushroomed, but the world of clients hasn't. I guess there must be that must be happening more and more, unless, of course, as I said earlier, you have given a lot of thought to what's your edge, what's your niche, and how do you create value. In which case, you're kind of operating in a very different space. So, there's quite a few challenges, and I think it's good you asked that, because I think I get asked so often by corporate people who are wanting to pivot to becoming coaches. What tips do I? And I feel like a sort of like a glass half empty person, which I really am not. But I really do advise them to think very carefully about this, because they're joining what I call peak coaching, where it really is sort of reaching coach mania levels. And so you really have to be either absolutely wedded to the craft and the purposeful nature of the work, and therefore not so bothered about, having a big client base or making a lot of money, or you have this very clear specialization, and you have you've given some thought to your go-to-market strategy.
Yeah.
Rather than just think that relabeling yourself is going to suddenly result in a queue of people wanting to be coached by you. That would be great, and I'm sure it happens to some people, but I haven't seen it myself very often.
Yeah. I once heard this analogy of, you could have the most beautiful peach in the world for sale, but not everybody likes peaches. So. Yeah,
very good point. Very good point. And actually, it's funny. I think that's a really good way of summarizing, the challenge of business building as distinct from product quality. You can have an amazing product, but it's a whole different ball game to get it to market.
Yeah.
And for it to scale.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing so openly. That's really, really great value for the audience. Okay, so I'd really like to move on to your journey now and take us all the way back to the beginning and understand, when you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, wow. Gosh. I vaguely remember I wanted to be important, but that sounds very vague. And I seem to have failed so far in that. I don't know what important meant to me as a kid. You know what? Maybe I was a bit peculiar. I mean, I grew up in India. I spent the first 10 years in India. And, my mother was a nurse and then a teacher. And I kind of knew I didn't want to be either of those things. And then, I grew up in a single parent household. So I didn't, I guess I didn't have very highly, I didn't have clear sort of role models for things that I thought I would like to do. But I kind of rather had strange sort of creative fantasies of, I don't know, like having a horse in India was like, ooh, that's quite impressive. So I kind of fantasized riding a horse, just silly things like that. So so I'm afraid I'm one of those very frustrating people that don't have wanted to be a train driver answer. I tell you, the one thing that I did think seriously about being was a computer programmer. But that was something that took hold more when I moved here in the 80s, when Sinclair, was sort of like an entrepreneur who came up with these affordable home computers. And I remember getting, I think it was like a ZX Spectrum and something else. I'm showing my age now.
Well, I remember, so me too.
So I really got into that, and maybe that was my nerdy, geeky phase. I used to, or maybe it's just being a teenager. I remember being up quite a lot of nights drinking. Mustn't, do not do this at home. Drinking lots of Diet Coke, and programming in BASIC, which was the computer language. I think it was, I don't know whether it was the ZX. I got the thing to play Connect 4 against me.
Wow.
It's not bad, for a 16-year-old. Although these days, of course, they've already built, Meta or Facebook or something. So I think it was something either silly and fantastical that I thought about, or, programming. And I did try and get a couple of computer programming jobs, but failed miserably. And so I became a banker instead.
So tell us about...
That's all I can say, really.
Okay. So tell us about, basic coding on the Sinclair to doing your A-levels and going to uni. What did that part of your life look like?
Yeah, so I I've kind of painted a picture of, a single parent family. There wasn't really a lot of money either. And, we were, clearly had moved from India to here. So that early period, I guess, it wasn't, I don't know, I struggle to say there was hardship, but there wasn't, we weren't rolling in it either. We lived on a council estate. There wasn't a lot of money. And so I was sort of fairly motivated to contribute rather than take.
Yeah.
And not that there was a lot to take. So that was all playing out. And I was quite smart, I think, but I really then started to lose interest in studying as well. This is terrible role modeling now for your listeners. But clearly the smartness doesn't go away just because you don't study.
Yeah.
But it doesn't translate into something other people can rely on if you don't study and qualify in things, because you can't then show them, look, here is some proof that I have a brain that works quite well. And so that's the advantage of studying and qualifying and persevering with all of that. But anyway, so I started my A-levels, kind of disappointed quite a few of the teachers in my sixth form. It was sort of a comprehensive in Surrey. I kind of just started working. And then later on, when I was around 19, I started to work at Bupa, the health insurance firm. And they obviously had hired quite a diverse bunch of people. And Bupa still, I think, has one of its big hubs near Royal Holloway, which is a university, part of University of London, but it's in Surrey. And so there were quite a few grads from there that kind of got temping jobs and so for the first time, I think, I started to interact with people that had been to university and becoming friends with them. And then, to cut a long story short, more than one of them thought, God, Farley, you should go and get a degree. That's really, and then of course you don't have A-levels either. Well, you better get some A-levels first. So I enrolled at night school and got a couple of A-levels, and then, saved some money to go to university and ended up at Manchester, which was fantastic. Manchester University, big city, north of England, quite different to anything that I'd experienced. And, I also said to myself, since I was driving all of the decision-making, it was all kind of intrinsic motivation. I kind of thought, well, if I'm saving up and there's an opportunity cost because I won't be earning any money, I think what's going to be quite important is to do something I'm actually interested in. And I was always interested in language and human behavior, maybe broadly put. And I grew up bilingual in India. And so I thought, language science. And then I discovered there's a word for it, which is linguistics. And so I studied linguistics in Manchester University and got a first. And I think that was partly because I just really loved the topic.
Yeah.
And, as part of that, I did a term in Germany. I studied a little bit of a lot of languages, Japanese and so on and so forth. So, that's how I kind of ended up getting a degree, sort of a bit of a circuitous route. But I'm really pleased I did.
Well, I think what's really great about that is, your experience at Bupa and meeting those other peers and them almost, I guess, almost highlighting your smarts and highlighting, hey, you should really think about doing this. And I think sometimes we rely on a role model or mentor to almost, I guess, have the belief in us to do something. But I think what's really nice about that example is it was peers and friends. And I think I really like that. Okay.
Yeah, and it came from sorry to interrupt you, but it came from a place of caring.
Yeah.
And having some conviction in my abilities rather than kind of, negative, you haven't got one, that's bad.
Yeah.
It was more, you would do really well. You should, it would be really good for you. Or, you're not playing to your strengths yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you finish your linguistics degree at Manchester. What happens next?
Well, so then a sort of comedy of errors kind of happens where, I'm quite naive still, and I think this is something that I'm quite keen that Manageable, which is the organization we set up, is partly addressing. But and a lot of other foundations and charities are tackling this issue of not being, there's a vicious circle that if you don't have well-networked parents, plural, you end up without a very big network yourself.
Yeah.
And then clearly there's also, economic aspects to this. If your parents are affluent, you get quite a lot more opportunities, clearly. And this inequality, clearly had an adverse effect on me. And I really didn't know very many people in business. And, perhaps naively also didn't even know that the university itself would be able to help. So I was just doing some Mickey Mouse job applications. I'd have this kind of dodgy looking CV. And I was in Germany at the time as well, trying to apply for jobs in London. And I remember sending, I don't know, I thought it was a lot. It was only about 30. People probably laugh now that I got a job after sending 30 job applications. But I thought at the time, gosh, I'm an absolute failure. I can't, everybody's saying no.
Yeah.
And I just had nobody helping, and it just felt like I was sort of like battling away on my own without any mentors or role models, and that big dose of naivety thrown in. And of course, this was pre-internet as well.
Yeah.
This was in just before, around, in the early 90s, and so you couldn't just Google, CV, and I was also really unclear about what industry even I wanted to work in. Hopefully this resonates with some of your listeners, and clearly this is really why I find what you're doing so purposeful. So I kind of was applying to PR agencies, investment banks, this, that, and the other. And I randomly found a job advert for a marketing graduate trainee position in an investment management company in the city. And I thought, just like the other 30, oh yeah, send them my one pager. And bizarrely, they wanted to interview me. And so I remember I probably looked about 12, and, I was actually, I was 24. I was a few years older because I went on my detour earning money. And I remember, I think I was slightly late as well for the interview. It was just like, shambolic. But I remember being interviewed by by a northerner in the city, and he was kind of a bit of an outsider in the organization. And I mean, apart from maybe thinking I had some talent, he probably thought, oh, I should give this outlier a chance as well. And so I got onto the marketing trainee. They only were hiring 2 graduates, one for the marketing stream, and actually they hired 2 on the much more prestigious investment manager stream where you actually manage money. But anyway, that was a huge inflection point really in my career, because that then led to me doing a whole heap of things that I've talked to you in reverse about. But yeah, so that's kind of not really a recommended route to getting a job on a grad program. But yeah, it's almost sort of, if it were turned into a television program, it would be a comedy, comedy of errors.
I'd really love you just to tell us a bit more about those first few months on that program. In the city, in a marketing role, in an investment management firm. I'm guessing you probably had to build some confidence and climb some steep learning curves pretty quickly.
Yeah, yes, it's safe to say it was quite daunting. And I really do relate to clients that talk to me about imposter syndrome. which, was coursing through my veins.
Mm.
And I mean, I really did feel like I didn't have a clue what was going on. Everybody was very supportive, and I think it was quite a small firm that I joined, which was in some ways really good because there were only 200 people at most, and that's the sort of number where you can kind of start to know almost everybody in the organization, and you also get to work with quite senior people, and CEO can talk to everybody, so it all helped kind of, I guess, reduce the stress of starting. It was a quite a daunting building as well, 155 Bishopsgate, which was quite newly built then in the city. But I think what's held me in good stead in pretty much all of the things that I've done is that those challenging kind of, I don't know what I'm doing feelings very quickly translate in me pulling out all the stops, working hard, digging deep, becoming quite tenacious or resourceful, and not kind of seeing what happens, being a bit fatalistic. I kind of, and I probably inadvertently make it seem effortless, but I do, I think, work very hard at plugging gaps that I identify. And I remember it was even like silly things that you might laugh now, but there was a time when using PowerPoint was new. And I don't know what we had. I don't know what I can only simplistically describe as portrait client reports. And a strategic decision was made that they should be landscape using PowerPoint. And of course I was thinking, what the hell is PowerPoint? and I remember spending weekends kind of busying myself learning PowerPoint so that I could appear kind of like, oh, yeah, PowerPoint. Yeah, definitely. That's the way to go. Yeah, landscape, much better, much more modern. But that's an example of how even these sorts of, I basically plugged a lot of gaps at the weekend just to feel like I'd get by. Yeah, but you're right. They were quite challenging times. But then exactly as you say, exactly as you'd expect, you very quickly know that you can get some support. There are other people going through similar things. I had to study alongside that because I did a diploma in marketing that the company sponsored. Mm-hmm. For my sins, I also did an investment management qualification, all at the same time. So it was really quite stressful period, the first 6 to 12 months, because I was trying to get to grips with being in London, getting to grips with my first sort of proper job, post-graduation. And then I had not only doing the job, but these 2 side hustles, qualifications that they kindly paid for. But yeah, I kind of came through.
Yeah. And so what happened after the graduate program?
So, I mean, that sort of evolved into my first job. I mean, I want to think now, I think I was called a marketing executive. I was very, pleased with my job. I was at the epicenter of the switch to using Netscape at the time, which sort of ancient history now. And you're laughing because you can remember all of that. And it was all quite an exciting time, really, to be at the beginnings of this revolution that we didn't know was going to be a revolution. And still have vivid memories of some of the colleagues that I'd work with. Yeah, so I then just sort of became a bit more embedded. I did some amazing things. I was asked to look after our Amsterdam office, which was a sort of an outpost, and amazing character called Rene who ran the office there. I'd go out from time to time. Yeah. And, we kind of developed this weird relationship where he was completely reliant on me, but he was sort of like, I don't know, 2 generations, on from me. And somehow we were sort of like, friends. And then they let me loose on, sales. They gave me sales responsibilities in markets that I imagined they thought I couldn't do too much damage in, smaller countries or countries that they weren't in already. And, and then I got headhunted, weirdly, having only 3 years experience of financial services, virtually no sales experience. But I think various things conspired to make me quite an attractive candidate for a division of HSBC, where they had their fingers burnt with another character that you might say was much more conventional. And so they thought, let's bring somebody in who's very different. And I think they characterized me as, a lot more cerebral than the last one. And so they were looking, well, I don't know what it was, but so I got offered an amazing role to build from pretty much zero, not quite, their non-UK sort of operations across Europe. And so that's how I kind of moved from a relatively small kind of boutique environment, which was my first job in the city, to somewhat glamorously being headhunted to this job that I was utterly unqualified to do, at least as far as I knew. And I even said this to them. But they knew what they were doing, I think, because they kind of had a particular profile in mind. And I think they were absolutely right, because, when you want to start a new market, there's a lot of thinking that you need to do. There's a lot of strategy that needs to be developed. And so I guess they were smart in that they knew they needed somebody that could be analytical, that could be quite thoughtful, and could make choices about different ways you could crack a big region. And I suppose they were right. I kind of cracked Europe, at least for the while that I was there. So that's how I got into HSBC, and that was another amazing experience that spanned 20 years in the end.
Wow. We probably don't have time to go through that whole journey at HSBC, but would you be able to kind of call out the key jobs or key departments that were on that HSBC journey?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I started in sales, and really it was a sort of fancy title for me at the beginning, which was, head of European sales. And really there was a lot of research and development to do. And so, I spent 3 years doing that fairly successfully. And then I thought I wanted to be a management consultant, and spent all of 3 months being a management consultant, having left HSBC on very good terms. And then they brought me back in a global role. And because the CEO of the asset management division really felt like there was a need for a marketing function. Yeah. So I was brought in as global head of marketing, again, a function that kind of existed in local offices around the world, but not in any sense a global function. So again, sort of new territory. And that's really the theme of almost all of my roles at HSBC, actually. So I kind of started off in sales when there was really no sales. And then I was brought in to be global head of a function, marketing, that needed to be created, unified. And then I added product development. Again, that didn't exist as a global function. And then that kind of led to me going onto the board of the asset management division, which for a large organization like HSBC is still quite a small division. But and then I kind of, with another ex-colleague of mine, Barbara, we globalized the sales function, which was probably the most radical thing we did. And I became global head of, I guess, co-head of sales globally.
Yeah.
And then that's when I kind of got offered an opportunity in the investment bank to bring together all of the business that the investment bank was doing with the retail bank worldwide. So, it's sort of like foreign exchange, some investment products, and stock brokerage. So that was actually a massive business, over $1 billion, which they asked me to get my arms around and professionalize and develop a strategy for. So I did that, and so that's really a very potted 20-year span in a few minutes.
That's really great, thank you. And I think what's really nice about that journey that you've just talked us through is that you're obviously somebody that says yes. You can be thrown in at the deep end and rise to the challenge, and yeah, I think that's really impressive. So thank you. And then I think and I think that takes us to, I guess, today, where you left HSBC to set up your executive coaching practice, and now coach and CEO at Manageable. Thank you.
Yes, so we've come full circle.
So looking back on this career journey, just give us the highs and give us the lows.
Wow, yeah, the highs. I really got to see the world. I really got to see the world, and that was that still feels like an amazing opportunity. Mainly at HSBC, and it's a global organization with. At one point, I was responsible for teams in 30 countries, and I represented all of those teams, 700 odd people, at a global level on the board. And so, that sort of privilege and opportunity was definitely a high.
Yeah.
Founding my own practice, selling me successfully, was clearly another high. And quite distinct from representing a large corporation, where people would struggle to say no. If you want a meeting and you're from, a large bank, it's very difficult to say no. But, meeting Farley, some nobody who's a coach, you can easily say no, and lots of people have. But building a successful practice from scratch and in a field that really I wasn't even in, feels like actually, now I think about it, actually quite impressive. And then now, being a co-founder, with quite a lot of individuals' money invested in the business, and a small team that has lent team of individuals who've decided to lend their talent to Manageable. Feels like another massive positive so far. And I mean, I've obviously talked a lot about all of the clients that I've helped, and they all kind of matter, all of their movements, some progress that they've made, and in some cases transformation. Yeah, so what a lot to be thankful for and pleased about.
Yeah, thank you. And what about the biggest challenge of the journey?
Well, along with all of these inflection points that I've talked about, dropping out of school at 17, not going to university, deciding to go to university, not getting jobs, getting a job, and then, being given significant responsibilities quite early on in my career, too early perhaps, if I'm honest, came with a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
Am I doing the right thing, giving up my job at Bupa to go to university? Am I going to do well? Because I don't know how this works. Am I going to make it in the city? And then, leaving HSBC, I mean, it's quite hard to leave if they don't want you to leave. And I must say, I spent quite a while trying to leave, and in the end, it was all very amicable. But you kind of think you're giving up something voluntarily, and the organization wants you to stay. So there's quite a lot of doubt that sets in, and I was, well looked after, and you kind of worry, is this am I doing the right thing here? Because everybody else thinks it's bonkers. And retraining, I left out that I did 2 master's degrees along the way, but, again, studying when you're supposed to is difficult enough, but studying, when you're a mature student with a lot of pressures, children, etc., family, job, that's a whole different ball game. And you kind of do suddenly think, yes, I know I can do well in an academic environment, but am I able to crack this? And you get rusty as well. So quite a lot of these choices that I seem to have made myself, to put myself in a position of failure. It's great that you don't fail, but it's quite quite nail biting. Until you know that it was okay, or actually, gosh, who would have thought? But it's actually genius. But it's easy to look back and think of all these moves as brilliant, but actually, quite a few of them were random or hunches, and you do have to be comfortable with quite a lot of uncertainty and the willingness to be a complete and utter flop.
Yeah.
And if you know this as well as I do, Joe, if we don't put ourselves out there, we definitely won't make as much of an impact.
Yeah.
But if you do put yourself out there, you've got to be willing to flop. And that I guess is another part of my recollection, quite often being quite anxious about being a failure.
Yeah, I think that I definitely felt those feelings along my own journey, and done a lot of reading around the topic. And you have to almost be comfortable, don't you, with taking a leap of faith. And I really tried to rather than think about what's the worst that can happen, I tried to think about what's the best that can happen, and then of course doing the everyday actions that will hopefully lead to that good outcome. So thank you very much for sharing.
Yes.
I'd love if we could spend some time on the importance that role models and mentors and sponsors have had on your journey.
Oh, massive. And I'm a big advocate, and I think you can't surround yourself with enough. And I mean, I'm living that now. Some may argue that, I've been around the block in a variety of roles, had global roles, I've been employee number 1. But still, I thought about the challenge of founding Manageable as a tech business. And, we've brought in 2 advisors, one of whom is the chair of the company. He's had a lot of experience as CEO, and another one who's got a lot of experience advising startups. And so I've surrounded myself with at least these individuals. And, we're also on an accelerator program, TechNation, which we applied for and got. And so we're getting a lot of support from TechNation. And we can't get enough help. And personally, similarly, Joe, when I decided to pivot to executive coaching, I went and I sought out a lot of coaches that were highly recommended and sought their advice. And some of them were kind enough to, give me a lot of encouragement, maybe not so much advice, but just encouragement. And that's really underrated. You'd be silly to probably implement somebody else's recipe for success because it's their recipe. But if they encourage you to come up with your own recipe for success, that is really powerful. But that encouragement needs to be sought
Yeah.
And I think, it's positive role models, it's mentors, it's friends.
Yeah.
So I think it's hugely important. And I kind of I have this distinct phase of my life where I lacked them.
Mm.
And I think that resulted in me, to be honest, probably going through the eye of the needle. Whereas now I feel that, I've surrounded myself with, positive role models. That means I'm going through a much bigger eye in a smaller needle. So, I think it really does help you navigate adversity and challenge with a bit more room for maneuver as a result of that ecosystem of support. So I think it's hugely important.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think some people struggle with asking for help and accepting help. And I think that, if you are one of those people, find a way, because it will help you immeasurably.
Yes. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Okay. So for anybody who's thinking about, I quite like the sound of this coaching, I'd quite like to consider this as a career for myself. Would you say there's any helpful educations or trainings that people should consider?
Well, I mean, I did a master's in executive coaching, and there are a lot of qualifications, and there are a lot of people that have them. So I think rather than identify any particular one, I think there's a lot of due diligence that would be helpful. And, it is also a question of preference. Do you need to study in the evenings?
Yeah.
Are you able to commit to something more full time? Do you want to have the hustle and bustle of something in a city, or do you want to be out in the wild? So I studied at Ashridge, which is in a beautiful sort of country setting, but it's not for everybody. So I think there's some due diligence and probably the format as well. Is it quite a small group setting?
Yeah.
What are the faculty like? Have they what have they written about? What are their research backgrounds? So I kind of did a lot of due diligence before choosing. So I think more so than ever before, it is quite important to have a really quite rigorous qualification in executive coaching, and especially if you want to crack the corporate market, which is the biggest market really for executive coaches. The buyer is very sophisticated and is often themselves a qualified, accredited coach.
Yeah.
And so having put themselves through that, having overcome that high bar, they're definitely not going to choose anybody that they don't consider to be an equal.
Yeah.
And I say all of that because there has, I think, also been a proliferation of coaching courses, which are all great, but you probably get what you put in and pay for. And if it's half a day course versus a 2-year master's, well, you're not shooting the breeze over here and doing all your learning over here. There's clearly I'm generalizing massively, but I think there is, if it is a profession, if you want to be taken seriously, then I think this ability to evidence the effort you've put into your training, to building up your practice is quite important. And then, alongside that, Joe, is what I said earlier about giving some thought to your, what kind of coach are you? And that is a blend, I think, of what sorts of people you want to work with, what sort of impact do you want to have, what experience do you bring, and what character you are. I mean, if you're very playful, that is seductive. but that's very different to somebody who's helping people with gravitas.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's worth doing this. It sounds a bit over analytical, but a little bit of an audit on these 4 or 5 points.
Yeah.
Which together I think will probably tell a story to clients that hopefully end up making you distinctive in a very, very crowded space.
Yeah. Thank you. What about soft skills? If you had to name the top 3 soft skills that make for a great executive coach, what would you say?
Well, here's where I probably go off on a kind of contrarian angle. I would say being able to build something. There's being able to build rapport, trust.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important. And and what I mean by going off is that the cliche is being a great listener. But I mean, there is some research that suggests that if all you do is listen, people don't think you're a very good listener because you're not involved in the conversation. You're not engaged, and we find these people really quite dull. So being a great coach, I think, is about being considered trustworthy, having that relationship, which in many ways is the platform that leads to change.
Yeah.
The relationship that you build is what enables you both to talk about difficult subjects, to have tension, to challenge, and also to support and be there. So that, you've got to be brilliant at relationship building.
Yeah.
And I think, again, counterintuitively, you've got to be able to pull off being challenging whilst being considered constructive. So it's sort of being able to navigate caring challenge.
Yeah.
Or to be challengingly caring. This is, I think, what an unusual combination. And just being very, warm and supportive is not going to get you very far.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot more people out in the world that can be warm and supportive.
Yeah.
That you don't need to pay for often, really. That's what your friends do. But being caring and challenging is something that I think becomes more valuable.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, I'll stop there because there's a lot of, I could go on with, what are the, so I would, by the way, I would also be quite challenging, of yourselves, those that are listening. What is the evidence that that's something you'd be really good at?
Yeah.
What evidence is there that you have gone from no relationship with someone to a rock solid one very quickly for some unknown reason? And what evidence is there that you are able to embrace some healthy conflict, some healthy tension, whilst caring for someone?
Yeah.
And nobody's falling out. And these are quite, these are sort of nuanced sort of skills, aren't they? That you don't get asked about in interviews. Yeah. But I think they're really quite important. It goes without saying that you do have to be a really perceptive, reflective listener. It goes without saying. And I feel that you also need to be quite thoughtful about the words or the signals that you wish to employ.
Yeah.
And that is harder than it sounds, because you're being watched and you're being listened to by your clients. And I think being parsimonious with the words, which I struggle with clearly, and regulating the signals that you're sending so that you don't communicate are also really quite important. So sort of some sense of self-regulation, self-perception, self-management is another. Maybe those are the three pillars, which sound I don't know, like they will build the temple of executive coaching success.
Brilliant, thank you. So, apart from this podcast, could you recommend any other resources that people could go check out if they're thinking that this might be the profession for them?
I would try coaching, meaning get a coach, because there's nothing better than seeing what it's like from the other side of the fence. And in any case, I think coachability is a crucial quality, which will also be needed if you want to learn the language of coaching. You need to be coachable. You need to be willing to go back to school and know nothing. And, it does take an adjustment because, we all think we can talk. We all think we can listen. We all think we can read people. But no, it's not that straightforward. So one tip would be, get some coaching if you haven't already been coached. And clearly, I had the benefit of quite a few executive coaching experiences where I was the client. So I really did know what I was letting myself in for. I would talk to people that have been coached and have found it to be unsuccessful and why, and successful and why. I would, you create a network if you choose your training provider right. And having been to Ashridge, aside from it being, a preeminent coaching institution, there were a lot of amazing people that I trained with and learned from. And that, network proved invaluable as a support network, but also as a sort of a sounding board. More so than when I started. I mean, even then, there are literally too many books on coaching. And so, I would, recommend, diving into a few. There's so many, I'm reluctant to recommend anything. And there's probably something that's just been written that's even better. But, I think also not to be forgotten, and you touched on this earlier, Joe, it is not just the craft of coaching, but you're also in charge of the enterprise, even if you're the only worker. So I think there's also something about business building, business management, marketing, sales. And I was fortunate in that sort of stuff came easily to me with my background in sales and marketing and management and leadership. But for many people, that's a real challenge. And it's easily overlooked. And as you said, you can have a great product, but what if, or you can have, I think you talked about it. Yes, you can have something brilliant, but it has to, you have to get it to market. And so another tip would be to, get some help or read about or go and spend some time with business people, the people that have ideally created a professional services organization, even if it's just of one person, because they really do know all of the difficulties that involves, including loneliness. Because if you're really on your own selling yourself, it can be quite lonely. And hence many people prefer a much bigger social construct where they're an associate of a bigger organization, rather than an individual sort of freelancer or managing partner, at the beginning. So those are some tips, Joe. I don't know if that was particularly coherent, but I probably have a lot more, but that's probably more than enough.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And I'll put the link to, I think there's a couple of coaching federations, put the links to those in so that people can go and have a look at those as well to find out a bit more. Okay.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, there's there are a few associations. The Association of Coaching.
Yeah,
I'm a member of.
Yeah. Okay. So as we move towards wrapping up, Farley, what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you were just starting out?
Yes, this sounds funny, but I think when I was starting out, I probably was trying too hard to prove my value, and it can lead to you over preparing or turning some conversations a little bit too much into how qualified you are or about how you coach, when really that's not about your client. So I think it's what I said earlier. Focusing on the relationship as the vehicle for change, and I think that takes a lot of pressure off, because knowing the insides and outsides of your client's career doesn't help if what they want to talk about is a difficult relationship that's bothering them now. And so there's an element of having the confidence to just be fully present and trust that so long as you've invested in a high quality relationship, you will create value. So I hadn't quite appreciated that early on, and so you're kind of spinning wheels trying to appear prepared, be prepared, appear to be knowledgeable. And I think that is clearly not unimportant, but it can actually become a distraction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And what would you say to a 16-year-old Farley who was thinking about computer science and doing that basic coding?
What would I say? I would say failures can lead to even more success. But don't be too down about not cracking the nut that you think you need to crack in the moment. Because now, of course, looking back, some early failures led to some significant success.
Yeah.
And who knows what else would have happened, but it's not too bad what has happened.
Yeah. It'll all be okay in the end.
Yes. Well, but so long as it's not an excuse for not doing any hard work.
True.
If we're putting ourselves out there, taking a bit of a risk. And so I would probably, because I took some of those setbacks, they are quite challenging. But I think maybe you just have to live through them.
Do you have a favorite quote or expression that you find helpful?
Well, I used to use this one quite a lot, which is, we need to add a zero. And, I used to say this originally, when I was at HSBC, because, there was so much opportunity. But I still think, it applies in so many things that we do. You can add a zero, and that is multiplying it by 10. And maybe you can add a few zeros. And actually, the smaller you are, or either in your journey or in your career or in your role or in an organization like Manageable, which is very, very young, the more zeros you can add.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're, a giant organization, you might actually take a zero away. That's entirely possible. So think about adding zeros. I used to say that quite a lot. I also say this quite often, particularly to coaching clients, which is, don't solve problems with problems. And it's amazing, Joe, how often we get ourselves in these ruts where we solve problems with problems. And, it's, random example, you're nervous about giving a speech, and you think that the solution to that is to practice all night. Well, this is a new problem. It doesn't necessarily solve the original problem, which is, why are you nervous?
True.
Is it that you are lacking in knowledge about the content? Very rarely. It's often the experts that are being called to do the speech, but they're nervous and they don't need to learn more about that topic. They need to explore some other solution. So this is quite a common thing where we, me included, with very good intentions, solve problems with problems. Yeah. And that's another one that often people think, oh gosh, what's that? That's like, that's enough, Joe. I probably, use a lot of little lines that.
Oh, I like them both. Thank you. Well, Farley, thanks so much for joining us. I've really enjoyed learning more about executive coaching and also taking a deep dive into your journey, which has been, really incredible. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Any final?
Pleasure, Joe.
Oh, good. Any final words of wisdom or encouragement for the audience before we go?
Well, if you set your mind to it, you can have an amazing impact on people as their coach. So go for it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed the show. If you gained any value out of today's episode, please help us spread the word by subscribing to the podcast. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, we would love your feedback. Please use the links in the show notes to get in touch. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.